As I'm sure you all know, one of the biggest questions in all of history is what caused the First World War. There have been tens of thousands of books and articles written about why this or that was the true cause of the war. For over a century, historians have been trying to grapple with this incredibly complicated and difficult question. But despite that, there's still no widely agreed upon answer as to what caused the war. Now, in my view, what all those historians were getting wrong is that they didn't realize that the correct way to handle such a nuanced and sensitive question is to turn it into a tier list video. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware that tier list videos have brought clarity to many of life's most important questions, such as what is the best fruit? What is the worst superpower to have? Or even a question that's kept all of us awake at night. What is the best chicken sandwich? And so today, with the enormous explanatory power of the tier list video, we're going to answer once and for all that eternal question: what caused World War I? Now, for those that don't know the premise of a tier list video, essentially I'm going to go through some often talked about potential causes of World War I and rank them based on whether I think they really did cause the war to happen. The ranking is going to be from S tier, which are things that I think played a crucial role in causing the war, to E tier, which are things that I think had no importance at all. So, first let's go through the contenders. These are the potential causes that I'm going to be ranking. The first is the naval arms race between Britain and Germany. Second is French resentment due to the loss of Alsace and Lorraine. Number 3 is the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Number 4 is Britain not being clear about what it would do if a war were to break out. Number 5 is the system of alliances that existed in Europe at the time. Number 6 is people not seeing or not realizing just how long and bloody the war would turn out to be. Number 7, this one you probably won't have come across. It's the idea that everyone at the time thought that attackers had a significant advantage on the battlefield. Number 8 is the imperialism of the Emperor of Germany, Wilhelm II. And finally, number 9 is the decline of the Ottoman Empire. So, those are the things that I'm going to be considering. Now, before actually diving into the ranking of them, I do think it would be worth having an overview of the history, just like I normally do, just to get everyone up to speed. I'm sure many people won't need this, so do feel free to skip ahead if you want to. But for those that want it, here is a quick summary of the events leading up to World War I. Before that, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Surfshark VPN. If you use Surfshark VPN while using the internet, your data will be encrypted and routed through their secure servers. That means that your browsing activity remains private, your data will be protected, and your real location will be hidden. In the modern world, that can be useful for all sorts of things. Perhaps you live in the UK and you would like to be able to speak your mind on social media without risking becoming one of the 30 people per day who are arrested for thought crimes. VPNs also allow you to get deals which are only available in certain parts of the world. For instance, some apps, like Tinder, change how much they charge you based on where they think you are in the world. Also, streaming services offer different programs depending on your location. Using Surfshark allows you to change where you appear to be to get access for more services at a better price. If you want to try Surfshark now, go to surfshark.com/HSH or use the code HSH at checkout to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN. In June of 1914, Europe was at peace and war didn't seem to be on the horizon. There were, of course, tensions between various countries. Particularly strong were those between Austria and Serbia, who had conflicting claims over land in the Balkans. Serbia had a strong nationalist movement that wanted to see a bigger, grander Serbia that included all the ethnic Serbs from the region. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was now very weak and, frankly, barely holding itself together. Many people thought it might break apart at any minute, and should that happen, Serbia wanted to be in a position to take as much territory as possible. Serbia was particularly hacked off about something that Austria had done 6 years earlier.
Austria had been administering the territory of Bosnia, which was, on paper, part of the incredibly weak Ottoman Empire. In 1908, the world was stunned when Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia, incorporating it into their empire. Serbia was incensed by that, and some Serbian nationalists even called for war. Tensions persisted, but Europe just about held itself together. Then came the assassination. On the 28th of June 1914, in Bosnia, a Serbian nationalist assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That was absolutely huge. Perhaps a modern-day equivalent would be something like 9/11. Austria was of course outraged by the assassination of their heir, but they weren't sure how to respond. Should they go to war with Serbia? If not, what should they do? Germany was allied with Austria and promised to back it, whatever it chose to do. Meanwhile, Russia was allied with Serbia and promised to defend Serbia should Austria go to war. Eventually, Austria decided it would send Serbia an ultimatum. Serbia must either accept various humiliating demands or Austria would invade. On the 23rd of July, almost 4 weeks after the assassination, the ultimatum was sent. The Serbians agreed to some but not all of the terms, and so 5 days later Austria declared war. The next day it began shelling the Serbian capital. At the same time, Russia, fearing attack from both Austria and Germany, had been readying its military. That process, known as mobilization, was hugely provocative to Germany. Fearing Russian attack, Germany issued its own ultimatum, demanding that Russia stop mobilizing. Russia refused, and so Germany declared war. With Russia and Germany at war, another great power was drawn into the conflict, France. France was allied with Russia, and so it also had to declare war on Germany. With Germany threatened on both sides, it decided to attack France, hoping for a quick victory that would allow it to divert its military towards Russia. Attacking France required going through neutral Belgium, and that provoked Britain. After German troops advanced into Belgium, Britain declared war.
So, that is what happened. Now, before diving into actually ranking all the potential causes, I want to talk a bit about the criteria by which I'm going to be judging them. Essentially, what is causation? Now, needless to say, this is a huge question. It's literally a whole field of philosophy. But for the purposes of this video, I'm really going to be evaluating the potential causes on 2 criteria. The first is the simple question of, would World War I have happened if X supposed cause hadn't happened? I think this is the simplest and most intuitive conception of what causation is. Essentially, if A causes B, that means that B wouldn't have happened if A had also not happened. Something else that I'm going to be taking into account is how close in time a particular cause was to the outbreak of the war. So things will be ranked higher the closer they were in time to the outbreak of the war, and ranked down for having happened a long time before it. That is because I think the more time something happened before the outbreak of the war, the more I think it needs to be taken for granted. So for instance, someone might make the case that the Napoleonic Wars or the Peace of Westphalia set the stage for World War I. The problem is that at some point, if you go back far enough in time, you kind of just need to take these things for granted. Otherwise, you end up saying that the birth of Jesus or the Big Bang caused World War I. And while it is true that World War I wouldn't have happened if the Big Bang had never happened, it's also a bit meaningless and not remotely interesting. Related to that is that I'm going to be taking into account whether or not it's actually possible to imagine a potential cause not being the case. So, for example, World War I would probably not have happened if all men were intrinsically good and peace-loving. That may be true, but the problem is that it's so fanciful, it's so far from the reality that we're actually living in, that it's not interesting or relevant. If we compare that with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, there it's extremely easy to imagine that not having happened. All that would have needed to happen was Franz Ferdinand to not go out in his car that day. And so because of that, I'm going to score it higher. So with all that out the way, let's have the first contender. This is, of course, the naval arms race between Britain and Germany. This is one of the more famous causes on the list. I remember it was one of the factors that I was taught in school. So first, let's have a bit of background on what the naval arms race was. I'm sure you all already know that for a very long time, the major naval power in the world was Great Britain. That was really established after the 7 Years' War of the mid-1700s, And then for a century and a half, Britain had essentially undisputed dominance over the oceans. However, in the early 1900s, there was a new major power in Europe, the newly unified Germany. Germany was doing very well at the time. It had a big population, its economy was growing fast, and it wanted to challenge Britain's naval supremacy. Now, generally, the arms race is thought to have started around 1906, when Britain made the HMS Dreadnought. And the reason that that was such a big deal was because the Dreadnought was essentially a huge leap forward in terms of technology. It was much faster than previous ships. It also had more powerful guns. And the effect of all that was that it rendered all ships that came before it obsolete. Even Britain's own fleet was rendered outdated. That acted almost like a reset of naval power. It meant that although Britain had its enormous legacy fleet, that now didn't count for much, and it kind of leveled the playing field. That gave an opportunity to Germany to try to rival Britain's naval dominance, and that is exactly what they tried to do. The German government actually passed a total of 5 separate laws to try to increase their shipbuilding, and that was with the explicit goal of competing with Britain. As you imagine, that was completely unacceptable to Britain. Britain actually had at the time what was called the two-power standard, which meant that it wanted its navy to always be as strong as the next 2 largest navies combined. Obviously, that wasn't compatible with Germany's newfound ambitions. So the arms race began around 1906, and both sides became pretty preoccupied with it. They talked about it in their parliaments. They reassured themselves that they were going to win. Just to give you a sense of what that sounded like, here is a quote from the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey. In 1907, he said, "We shall have 7 dreadnoughts afloat before they have 1. In 1910, they will have 4 to our 7. But between now and then, there is plenty of time to lay down new ones if they do so." Now, the arms race ran from 1906 to 1912, and it ended basically because Britain won it, and it actually won it fairly easily. If you have a look at this table, you can see that in 1914, on the eve of World War I, Britain had almost twice as many dreadnoughts and more than twice as many personnel in its navy. So, coming back to the question of whether the naval arms race caused World War I, it's easy to see how it could have been a potential cause. Britain and Germany had that rivalry, which significantly worsened their relationship. Then when the opportunity to go to war with each other presented itself, they took it so that they could sort out their differences. So, does this work as a theory? Well, in my opinion, despite being one of the most famous theories for why World War I broke out, there are some pretty big problems with the naval arms race theory. The first is that the arms race was over by the time World War I started. Now, to make this point for me, I've actually found an absolutely ancient clip of the historian Neil Ferguson explaining why he doesn't think it's a good theory.
It's very often argued that the First World War is due to the construction of a German navy. This is a myth. The whole arms race at sea was over by 1912 because the Germans realized that they couldn't compete financially with Britain's battleship building program.
So, that's one problem with the idea, the fact that the naval arms race finished 2 years before World War I even started. But I think perhaps an even bigger problem with this theory is that if World War I was caused by Britain and Germany having this rivalry and wanting to go to war with each other, then you would expect during the July crisis, as the storm clouds of war were gathering, you would expect Britain and Germany to be really up for a war with each other. You would expect them to be driving the escalation and talking about how great it was going to be that they were going to be able to defeat one another. The problem is, when we look at what actually happened during the July crisis, and when we look at what the British and Germans were saying, we don't see anything like that. In my opinion, we see essentially the opposite. If we first have a look at what the British were saying and doing, the whole way through the July crisis, Britain was trying to de-escalate. It actually wanted the whole situation to be put to a peace conference. Now, there are loads and loads of quotes from British officials showing how much they wanted to prevent the war from happening. I'll give just a few. This one is from the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith. He said, "We are within measurable or imaginable distance of real Armageddon." Then a few days later, as Germany was invading Belgium, he said, "The whole prospect fills me with sadness. We are on the eve of horrible things." In fact, Asquith was so upset by everything that was going on that at one point he actually broke down in tears. Also very important to remember is that right up until the very last minute, the British were planning on not getting involved in the war. So here's another quote from Asquith. He said, "Happily, there seems to be no reason why we should be anything more than spectators." So I hope you would agree that all that completely contradicts the idea that the arms race had increased tensions so much that Britain wanted to go to war with Germany. Now let's have a look at what the Germans were saying and see if they were keen to go to war against the British. Well, here again, I would say they absolutely were not. In fact, one of the main things that the Germans were worried about throughout the July crisis was the prospect of war with Britain, and they talked a lot about ways that they could keep Britain out of the war. So I'll give just a few quotes to support that. Here's one from the German Chancellor. Basically, just before the war started, he urged Austria-Hungary to accept mediation with Serbia because he was worried about a potential war with Britain. He said, "We are on the brink of a conflagration in which England would be against us. Germany, as the result of England's hostility, would have to bear the brunt of the fighting." The Germans actively tried themselves to persuade the British not to get involved. So, for example, on the 29th of July, the Chancellor told the German ambassador to tell the British that if they remained neutral, Germany wouldn't try to take any territory from France if they won the war. He said, "We can assure the English cabinet, presupposing its neutrality, that even in the case of a victorious war, we will seek no territorial aggrandizement in Europe at the cost of France." As you can see, the Germans really wanted to keep Britain out of the war. Of course, the thing that actually got Britain involved in the war was Germany invading Belgium. And what's really key here is that even as the Germans were in the process of invading Belgium, they were still trying to persuade the British not to get involved. The German ambassador was told to tell the British government that Germany had no plans to annex Belgian territory and that they were only invading Belgium because they thought that France was planning to invade them, and so they had no choice. One other piece of evidence that the Germans didn't want to fight against the British is something that I'm going to talk more about later. But essentially, there was actually a moment where the Germans thought that they might be able to make a deal whereby they wouldn't attack France, and in return, both Britain and France would remain neutral. Anyway, at one point, they incorrectly thought that the British had agreed to that deal, and when the news of that made it to Berlin, they were celebrating. They were ecstatic. Anyway, long story short, the Germans really didn't want to fight a war with the British, and I hope you would agree that is absolutely not consistent with the idea that Britain and Germany were desperate to go to war with each other because of the big rivalry that had come about because of the naval arms race. Now, all that said, there is one potential way that the naval arms race theory can make a bit more sense, and that is that if rather than saying that it directly caused World War I, we say that what it did was to cool relations between Britain and Germany, which meant that after the assassination, during the July crisis, they were much less able to resolve the situation peacefully and de-escalate. So to try to work out whether that idea has any merit, I think it's worth asking the question of what were relations between Britain and Germany like before the naval arms race started? And the answer to that is that they were really pretty good. Now, that might sound counterintuitive, given that Britain and Germany then went on to fight 2 world wars against each other, but there are actually some good quotes to support that. Here's one from a man named Joseph Chamberlain, who was the British Secretary of State for the Colonies. In 1899, he said, "The natural alliance is between ourselves and the great German Empire." Chamberlain basically wanted an alliance with Germany in order to halt French and Russian expansion into China. So relations were good, but as soon as the Germans started building up their navy, it immediately cooled relations between Britain and Germany. So for example, in 1902, the First Lord of the Admiralty told the British Prime Minister, the more the composition of the new German fleet is examined, the clearer it becomes that it is designed for a possible conflict with the British fleet. So as you can see, the naval arms race did definitely damage relations between Britain and Germany, not enough to make them actively want war, but enough to make it harder for them to stop war in 1914. I think, if relations had remained as good as they had been previously, there is a good chance that the two countries would have been able to de-escalate during the July crisis. Overall, I think the effect of the naval arms race is actually very well summed up by this clip of the historian Margaret Macmillan.
The decision by the German government, and in my view it's a very important decision, to start building a large navy, to start building big battleships, to in effect challenge the British for their dominance of the seas. And the Germans could say all they liked, that they were only building a navy to protect their own trade, that they were building a navy so that they could build a colonial empire. But geography meant that that navy would sail out from the Baltic, or when the Kiel Canal was open, would sail out and right towards Britain. And so there was very real concern in Britain about what this meant. Admiral Tirpitz, who presided over the tremendous naval expansion, argued that building a big navy would force the British to become friends with Germany. And this was Tirpitz's famous risk theory. He argued that we will build a navy powerful enough that the British won't want to take us on. Our navy will probably never be bigger than the British Navy or even a match for it, but Britain has other enemies. And so if the British take on the German Navy, in so doing it will weaken itself to the point where it will then be at the mercy of the French, the American, the Italian, possibly even the Austro-Hungarian or the Japanese navies. And so Tirpitz argued, and his master Wilhelm II seems to have agreed with him, we will force the British to become friends with us. We will force the British, by building a big navy, to realize that they have to become friends with us, they have to give us a free hand, both in building a colonial empire and possibly a free hand on the continent. Well, in fact, it was a very, very serious miscalculation, because what the British did is decide, first of all, to outbuild the Germans, which is what they did, and effectively, I would argue, by about 1910, the British had won the naval race, but more importantly, perhaps, it persuaded the British that they needed to look for friends, not allies, but friends closer to hand. And so in 1904, the British settled their outstanding colonial issues with the French and formed the Entente Cordiale.
So as you can see, the naval arms race did affect the geopolitics of the time. It meant that Britain became more estranged from the Germans and therefore moved closer to the French. That said, for me, that is quite an indirect mechanism by which it contributed to World War I. So, coming to the rankings, where are we going to put the naval arms race in our tier list? Well, this might be controversial, but I think I'm going to give it a C. Now, it is true that the naval arms race fed into the geopolitical climate which set the stage for World War I, but ultimately, the First World War simply did not start as a conflict between Britain and Germany. It started, as you all know, in the Balkans, and Britain and Germany were very much drawn into it, and in Britain's case, very much against its will. So for those reasons, I think I'm going to give it a C. I certainly don't think that the naval arms race should really get anywhere near as much attention as it does. It's one of the most famous potential causes for World War I, and I really struggle to see how it warrants that. So, now for our second contender, Alsace and Lorraine. This is another of the really famous ideas that are often talked about. So, what were Alsace and Lorraine? Well, they are basically two regions on the border between France and Germany, and for a long time, both France and Germany claimed those territories as theirs. Initially, they were French. The French actually acquired them around the 1700s, and by the 1800s, they were pretty firmly under French control. However, many of the people in those regions were German speakers, and they had German traditions, and so Germany wanted Alsace and Lorraine to be part of their nation. That all came to a head in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Now, the Franco-Prussian War was very important, and it's something that I'm going to reference a few times throughout this video, so I thought I would just say a few words about it now for those that aren't familiar with it. It broke out in 1870, so that is only 44 years before the start of World War I. Because of that, the Franco-Prussian War was very much on people's minds as World War I was breaking out. The war started essentially because Prussia, led by Otto von Bismarck, wanted to provoke a war with France because that would help him unify all of the small Germanic states into one big state, Germany. Bismarck was successful in provoking his war, and Prussia went on to win the war, ultimately leading to the unification of Germany. Now, what really matters for what I'm talking about right now is that after the Franco-Prussian War, Germany took Alsace and Lorraine from France as part of the peace treaty that ended the war. As you would imagine, that was a very sore point for the French. Alsace and Lorraine had been theirs for centuries, and they had just had them taken off them by this newly unified Germany. Now, coming back to the outbreak of World War I, it's easy to see how potentially Alsace and Lorraine could have contributed to the outbreak of the war. The idea would be that France was bitter and resentful about having lost those territories, and so it was keen to go to war with Germany to win them back. So first, I'll try to make the case for this theory. One thing that this theory does have going for it is that the French really were very bitter about having lost Alsace and Lorraine. I was able to find several bits of evidence to support that. For instance, supposedly one French foreign minister was so obsessed with Alsace and Lorraine that his family wouldn't mention it when he was around. Also, I was able to find this great article which was published in 1914 in The Atlantic. The article essentially paints a picture of a France which had absolutely not got over the loss of those territories. In the words of the article, the French felt fear and hatred when they thought about the loss of Alsace and Lorraine. At one point, the article says that the emotional patriotism of France looked forward to revenge. At another point, the article explicitly states that the French looked forward to, quote unquote, a war of revenge or war of honor, which would bring France back her abducted daughters. So, reading all that, it would seem to be absolutely undeniable that surely the loss of Alsace and Lorraine would have played a big role in the outbreak of World War I. However, there is a big problem with this whole theory, and it's very similar to the problem with the naval arms race theory. Essentially, if France was determined to go to war with Germany to win back those territories, then we would expect, during the July crisis, to see France be very aggressive, very keen on a war, maybe even invade Alsace and Lorraine. However, when we look at what actually happened during the July crisis, that is absolutely not what we see. In fact, in my view, when we look at the behavior of the French during the July crisis, it seems to me that they were absolutely desperate to avoid war. Now, I have covered this in other videos, but essentially, the vast majority of quotes that I was able to find from during the July crisis show that the French really didn't want to have a war. In fact, some of the best quotes that show that are actually from Germans. So, for example, the German ambassador to France said, "The French Prime Minister does not wish to abandon the hope of maintaining peace, which is deeply wished for here." Another quote from another German official, he wrote, "I had until the last moment the impression that the French government wanted to avoid war at any cost." Now, something quite remarkable about that quote is that it was written on August the 4th, after the war had already started. So I think it really shows how the French were against war right up until the last minute. Another quote is from the German envoy from Baden, one of the German provinces. He wrote, "The French now really do not desire war under any circumstances. In fact, they actually fear it on account of their desperate financial position and perhaps also on military grounds. That is why they are setting all levers in motion in St. Petersburg to exercise a moderating influence there." So there he's talking about the French trying to influence the Russians to de-escalate. Continuing the quote, "Whether the peace-loving ruler and his foreign minister will retain the upper hand against the pan-Slav currents is a thing no one can predict." So as you can see, those three quotes very strongly suggest that the French wanted to avoid war. Now, another really great piece of evidence that the French didn't want war is actually from looking at the behavior of the French Prime Minister when they went to Russia. So for those that don't know, during the July crisis, the French leaders went to St. Petersburg to meet with the Russians, and there they decided what they were going to do about the whole situation. Basically, when they were there, the French Prime Minister kind of had a bit of a mental breakdown due to anxiety about the prospect of war. This is all outlined in Christopher Clark's book, Sleepwalkers. Apparently, at one point, the French Prime Minister was sat next to the Russian Tsar and was in such a state that he was unable to answer any questions that anyone asked him. A bit later, after lunch, when the Russian Tsar and the French President were listening to a military band, the French Prime Minister was far away on his own, talking to himself, so much so that people really noticed it. Another bit of evidence that the French didn't want war is the fact that they began mobilizing their military very late. In fact, the French Chief of Staff was tearing his hair out because he thought that they were losing so much time and that would put them at a huge disadvantage relative to Germany. Eventually, the French government did agree to mobilize, but even then, it demanded that the French troops remain 10 kilometers away from the German border. Now, in my view, that is an absolutely enormous bit of evidence that the French really didn't want war. They were literally compromising their ability to fight a war in order to avoid provoking the Germans. The order was to be enforced extremely strictly, to the point that any soldier that disobeyed it was at risk of getting court-martialed. So I'll just read a bit of what the order actually said. It said, "No patrol, no reconnaissance, no post, no element whatsoever may go east of the said line. Whoever crosses it will be liable to court-martial, and it is only in the event of full-scale attack that it will be possible to transgress this order." Now, for me, that is kind of the nail in the coffin for the whole Alsace and Lorraine theory. If France wanted to go to war with Germany in order to win those territories back, that is the opposite of what they would have done. What they would have done is, of course, invade rather than pulling troops back. So overall, for me, this whole theory really doesn't work as a potential cause of World War I. I think the most that can be said for it is that French resentment over Alsace and Lorraine did feed into the geopolitical scene before World War I. You could make the argument that if Germany hadn't taken Alsace and Lorraine and France didn't have that resentment, that bitterness, then relations between the two might have been better, and maybe they would have been able to work together to de-escalate during the July crisis. Now, it is of course true that relations between the two nations were very tense, and that was in large part due to Alsace and Lorraine, but I still just don't find it compelling as a potential cause of World War I. I mean, by that point, France and Germany had had a tense relationship for decades without it leading to a world war. And most importantly, when the prospect of war became a possibility in the July crisis, and France had the opportunity to try to win those territories back, it absolutely didn't want to take it. So, coming to the rankings, I think I'm going to have to put this one in the D tier. Okay, so moving on. Number 3, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Now, initially, this one might seem like it should obviously be S tier. After all, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand directly led to the July crisis, the escalation which turned into World War I. If Franz Ferdinand hadn't been assassinated, World War I would never have happened, and therefore this should be S tier. Now, that line of reasoning relies on one big assumption, which is that if Franz Ferdinand hadn't been assassinated, World War I would never have happened. However, we do need to consider the possibility that actually World War I might very well have happened even if Franz Ferdinand had never been assassinated. Potentially, it could have happened a few months or years later for a different reason. After all of the bigger, more structural factors that led to the war would still have been in place. Now, if it is the case that World War I was always going to happen, then actually the assassination of Franz Ferdinand essentially didn't matter very much. It happened to be the trigger of World War I in the timeline that we live in, but ultimately that's pretty insignificant because potentially the war was always going to happen, whether or not Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. So we really need to address this question of whether or not the war was inevitable. Now, it goes without saying that that is a question that's impossible to answer conclusively. However, there is actually one very valuable way that we can approach this question, and that is to look at some of the moments where World War I almost broke out, but then didn't. In particular, I think it would be good to have a look at the Bosnian crisis of 1908 and the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 13. So I'll just remind everyone quickly what those were. The Bosnian crisis of 1908 was essentially because Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia. Bosnia was, up until that point, officially part of the Ottoman Empire, but it was administered by Austria-Hungary. Then, in 1908, Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia, formally incorporating it into their empire. So, why was that such a big deal? Well, essentially because it made Serbia extremely angry. The Serbs were upset because they wanted Bosnia to ultimately become part of something like a greater Serbia, something like Yugoslavia. In fact, the Serbs were so enraged about the annexation that many Serbian leaders at the time actually called for war. So, for example, at one rally of 20,000 people in Belgrade, one political leader demanded that Serbia fight to the death to prevent the annexation. He said, "We will struggle until we are victorious. But if we are defeated, we will be defeated knowing that we gave our greatest effort and that we have the respect not only of all Serbs, but also of the whole Slavic race." Now, that sort of tone was far from exceptional. Other people were giving very similar speeches. For example, the Crown Prince gave a speech to a crowd of about 10,000 people where he said that he personally would lead a military intervention into Bosnia. He said, "I am extremely proud to be a soldier, and I would be proud to be the one who leads you, the Serbian people, in this desperate struggle for life and death, for our nation and our honor." So, as you can see, there was quite a war frenzy at the time. Anyway, in the end, Serbia didn't go to war, but that was only because it didn't have the backing of Russia. I think if it had had the backing of Russia, it's very possible that a major war would have started then. So that was the Bosnian crisis. Now for a quick overview of the Balkan Wars. The First Balkan War was essentially a whole load of Balkan countries fighting against the Ottoman Empire to reduce their influence in the region. Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro all joined forces to fight against the Ottomans and essentially kick them out of the Balkans. That coalition, which was called the Balkan League, was successful, and by the end of the First Balkan War, the Ottomans were left with almost no territory in the Balkans. However, after that war ended, there was disagreement over how to divide up the lands that had been taken from the Ottomans, and that then led to the Second Balkan War. Essentially, Bulgaria wanted more territory than it had received after the First Balkan War, and it decided to go to war against its former allies, Serbia and Greece. In the end, Bulgaria was defeated and it lost quite a lot of territory. So the question for us now is, how close did the Balkan Wars come to escalating into something like World War I? Well, I think there was one incident in particular where they came really pretty close. What happened was, during the war, Serbia occupied some territories in northern Albania. Then, when the wars finished, they never pulled out of those territories, despite international pressure. That was unacceptable to Austria-Hungary. In the end, in October of 1913, the Austrians sent the Serbs an ultimatum in which they demanded that they withdraw their forces from northern Albania. If the Serbs didn't comply, the Austrians would declare war. The result was much the same as what happened in the Bosnian crisis of 1908. Serbia didn't have the support of Russia, and so it was forced to back down. I'm sure you're seeing a pattern, which is that there are these repeated spats between Serbia and Austria-Hungary, and each time they're like a spark which doesn't catch fire until finally it does. In the Bosnian crisis of 1908, Serbia doesn't get the support of Russia, and so it backs down. After the Balkan Wars, there's another spat, and again, Serbia doesn't get the support of Russia, and so it backs down. Then, in 1914, after the assassination, there is the crucial difference, which is that Serbia does get the support of Russia, and that, of course, leads to the spectacular escalation into World War I. Now, there was actually a third episode worth mentioning where World War I might have broken out, and that is the Moroccan crisis. But I'm going to talk more about that later, so I won't say much about it here. But it was essentially another time where World War I might have broken out. So now we need to come back to the question of whether or not World War I was inevitable. Well, I actually think all those crises show that there was a very good chance that the war would have broken out one way or another. Those flashpoints kept on happening. They were happening regularly, and they would have continued to happen. Potentially then, it was only a matter of time until one of them escalated into a major war. Ultimately, there are only so many near misses that you can have before you have a fatal crash. Also, I think it's worth pointing out that it would have been possible for a big war to break out and it not start in the Balkans. Obviously, the Balkans was a very unstable region, so it was always very likely to be the trigger for a war. But it's worth remembering that many other nations had bad relations in the 1910s. I talked earlier about France and Germany having bad relations because of Alsace and Lorraine, and also Britain and Germany had bad relations because of the naval arms race. Also, Russia and Austria had pretty bad relations because they had conflicting claims over land in the Balkans. Even Italy and Austria-Hungary, which were supposedly allies, had disputes over territory. My point is that there were many other ways that World War I could have started. Overall, it is of course impossible to know whether or not World War I would have happened without the assassination, but for me it's kind of 60-40 in favour of it would have happened even if the assassination didn't. I really find it very easy to imagine some other crisis escalating in a similar way to what we saw in 1914. When I think of Serbia and Austria just having these spats over and over again, it seems to me like it was only a matter of time. So now to come full circle back to the question of how much the assassination of Franz Ferdinand caused the war, I do think it needs to score pretty highly. It was the trigger, it was the most direct and identifiable cause of the war. Something else that this theory has going for it is that it's very easy to imagine the assassination not having happened. All that would have needed to happen was for Franz Ferdinand to decide that he didn't want to go out in his open-top car that day. That said, I do think it's more likely than not that the war would have happened even without the assassination, and so for that reason I am going to mark it down a little bit. Overall, I think I'm going to give this one an A. Now for number 4, Britain not being clear about what it was going to do. So the idea here is fairly simple. Before the war, Britain didn't make clear that it would get involved if a war broke out. The Germans, the French, the Russians, none of them knew what Britain was going to do. Now, the reason that Britain specifically mattered so much is that it was the global empire. It was the world's superpower at the time. It had total dominance over the seas, which meant that if it went to war against Germany, there would inevitably be a naval blockade. That is, of course, what happened, and it was hugely important in the outcome of the war. So there was this situation where nobody knew what Britain was going to do, and because of that, everyone could hope they could deceive themselves into thinking that Britain was going to do what they wanted it to. France and Russia could hope that Britain was going to join the war on their side, while Germany and Austria were able to persuade themselves that Britain was going to stay out of the war. So the idea is, if Britain had clearly stated what it was going to do, that would have reduced the chances of a war. If it had clearly stated that it was going to get involved and go to war against the Germans, then that might have made the Germans more likely to back down. If, on the other hand, Britain had made clear that it wasn't going to get involved, that might have made France and Russia more likely to back down. As it happened, Britain wasn't clear, and so neither side backed down. So, first let's talk about what this theory has going for it. First, I definitely think that the premises are correct. I absolutely think it's true that Britain wasn't clear about what it would do, and I also think it's true that other nations were confused about what Britain would do. Now, the first thing to say to support that is that the British leaders themselves weren't even clear in their own minds about what they wanted to do. For the majority of the July crisis, they were planning to not get involved in the war. For instance, here's one quote from Prime Minister Asquith. He said, "Happily, there seems to be no reason why we should be anything more than spectators." That was the feeling right the way through the July crisis. In fact, in the final meeting where the British leaders decided that they were going to get involved in the war, they actually went to that meeting thinking that they weren't, and it was only during the meeting that they changed their minds. So, the British were unclear in their own minds about what they wanted to do, but they were also unclear to other nations, and in fact they actually gave them contradictory messages. For example, on the 27th of July, so just a few days before war broke out, the British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey said to the Austrian ambassador that Britain would get involved only to then tell the French ambassador, Paul Cambon, that they wouldn't. Needless to say, with Britain acting like that, the other nations ended up confused about what it was going to do. And perhaps the best example of that is a quite farcical episode that happened right on the eve of war on August the 1st. Now, at that point, the Germans were seriously hoping that they would be able to make a deal with the British, whereby both Britain and France would stay neutral and the war would take place in the east. So what happened was, on August the 1st, the British Foreign Minister met with the German ambassador, and at that meeting they had quite a misunderstanding. Essentially, the British Foreign Secretary gave the impression to the German ambassador that if Germany committed to not attack France, Britain would both stay neutral itself and also guarantee French neutrality. It would guarantee that France wouldn't invade Germany. Obviously, that was incredible news for the Germans. The German ambassador sent a telegram to Berlin to tell them what he had just been told. The telegram said, "This seems to mean that in the event of our not attacking France, England too will remain neutral and would guarantee France's passivity. I shall learn the details this afternoon. Sir Edward Grey has just called me on the telephone and asked whether I could give an assurance that in the event of France remaining neutral, we should not attack the French. I assured him that I could take responsibility for such a guarantee, and he will use that assurance at today's cabinet meeting." Now, in Berlin, when they got that telegram, they were absolutely ecstatic. They were literally popping the champagne corks. They immediately replied with a telegram saying that they wanted to accept the deal. In fact, the Kaiser himself sent a telegram to the British King, George V, in which he eagerly accepted the offer. Now, ultimately, the whole thing was just a misunderstanding. The British hadn't intended to make such an offer, and so when they were getting those telegrams, they were actually a bit confused. They replied to the Germans with a telegram which stated, "There must have been some misunderstanding between Prince Linchowsky and Sir Edward Grey this afternoon. Sir Edward Grey will arrange to see Prince Linchowsky early tomorrow to ascertain whether there is a misunderstanding on his part." Long story short, as you can see, people really didn't know what Britain was going to do, and so because of that, they ended up confused. Now, coming back to whether Britain's lack of clarity caused the war, the question is, would anything have been different if Britain had been more clear? First, I want to address the idea that if Britain had made clear that it would go to war, then maybe the Germans would have been more conciliatory. Well, I think a first piece of evidence in favour of that is the German behaviour during the misunderstanding that I just told you about. The Germans were, and I want to emphasise this, they were so worried about the idea of war with Britain that when they thought they'd avoided it, they were literally drinking champagne. I think that somewhat supports the idea that Germany might have been more conciliatory if they knew that the British were going to get involved. Now, another way that we can come at this question is to look at the Moroccan crises. So first I'll explain a bit about what they were. The first Moroccan crisis began in 1905. The background was essentially that Morocco was one of the few remaining independent states in North Africa, and France wanted to expand its influence there. That was something that had been accepted by the British. Now, the German Emperor Wilhelm saw that as an opportunity to test the Anglo-French alliance. So what he did was he opposed the French expansion into Morocco. In fact, in March of 1905, Wilhelm himself actually went to Morocco, and there he publicly declared support for Moroccan independence. As you can see, it was a very direct challenge to the French. Wilhelm demanded that the whole issue be put to an international conference which would decide Morocco's fate, and his hope was that that would isolate France diplomatically. In the end, Wilhelm's plan completely backfired. The leaders of the great powers did meet at a conference in Spain, but in the end it was Germany that was the one that found itself isolated. The only nation that supported Germany was Austria, while France got the support of many nations, including Britain, Russia, Italy, and even the United States. So that was the first Moroccan crisis, and it led pretty directly to the second Moroccan crisis. Essentially what happened was, after the first crisis, France was able to increase its influence in Morocco. As you would imagine, the local people weren't happy about that, and so in 1911, a rebellion broke out. In response to that rebellion, the French sent troops, and that provoked Germany. Germany feared that France was going to fully take over Morocco, and that would violate some earlier agreements that France had made. The situation escalated to the point that Germany actually sent a gunboat to a port in Morocco. As you can see, the situation was pretty serious, and it seemed like war might be a real possibility. Again, essentially Germany was trying to test Britain's commitment to France to see how Britain would respond. Well, the way that the British responded was to give full backing to France. In fact, the Chancellor gave a famous speech, what was called the Mansion House speech, in which he made very clear that Britain would come to France's defence if there was a war. So, with France and Britain firmly united, and with Britain very clearly willing to go to war, the Germans were forced to back down, and the crisis ended with France getting full control over Morocco. So, coming back to the outbreak of World War I, and this question of whether Britain's ambiguity played a role in causing the war, it would seem that the Second Moroccan Crisis really supports that idea. It seems to be a very clear example of the theory that when Britain firmly supported France, Germany would back down. Potentially the same thing might have been true in 1914. Now, for completeness' sake, I think it's worth talking about the other side of this argument, which is if Britain had made clear that it wouldn't get involved in a war, would France and Russia have been more conciliatory? Now, here I'm a bit less convinced that it would have changed much. Now, it was definitely the case that France and Russia viewed Britain as very important to have in their alliance. Here is a great quote to show that from Tsar Nicholas. At one point he said to the French ambassador to Russia, "We shall have weighty matters to discuss. I'm sure we shall agree on all points. But there is one question which is very much on my mind, our understanding with England. We must get her to come into our alliance." So, based on that quote, it seems plausible that France and Russia might have backed down if they knew that Britain wasn't going to join them. That said, I do think it's worth remembering how France and Russia actually ended up at war with Germany. It was, of course, because Germany sent them both ultimatums. Russia declined the ultimatum that it had to stop mobilizing, and France declined the ultimatum that it had to declare neutrality. I have to say, I am slightly doubtful whether either country was ever going to accept those ultimatums. Even if they knew that Britain was going to sit on the sidelines, I would question whether France or Russia would have agreed to the German demands. I think it would have been extremely difficult for the national pride of those two nations to be getting dictated to by Germany like that. So, Britain's ambiguity led to World War I. Where are we going to rank this idea? Well, overall, I find this idea pretty convincing. In particular, I think if Britain had made clear that it would get involved, it's quite likely that Germany would have backed down. Something else that this idea has going for it is that I do find it very easy to imagine that Britain could have been more clear. Just like in the Second Moroccan Crisis, where there was the Mansion House speech, in 1914 there could very easily have been something similar, with one of the British politicians giving a speech stating clearly that they would come to France's aid. Overall, I think I'm going to put this one in the A tier. Okay, so number 5, the system of alliances. Now, this idea is actually fairly often talked about when discussing why World War I happened. So first I want to explain what the whole idea is, what the system of alliances was, and how it could have led to World War I. Essentially, in 1914, the European nations were enmeshed in this big web of alliances. On one hand, there was the Triple Alliance, which was Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy, and that formed in 1882. On the other hand, there was the Triple Entente, which was made up of the United Kingdom, France and Russia, and that was established in 1907. Now, to make things more complicated, individual nations within those alliances had alliances with nations outside of them, and by far the most important example of that is Russia having a very strong alliance with Serbia. Now, the reason that these alliances are so important is because they can have a very escalatory effect. It means that if two countries have a spat with each other, their allies are much more likely to get involved. They might even be treaty-bound to get involved, and that can lead to a big escalation. Of course, that is exactly what happened before World War I. What was initially a conflict between Serbia and Austria escalated because the allies of both those countries came to their aid. Now, in my opinion, the escalation itself is almost the most important thing about the outbreak of World War I. I mean, if the war had just been a war between Austria and Serbia, that wouldn't have been in any way surprising or noteworthy. It would have been one of many small wars that were happening around that time. What makes World War I the First World War is the degree to which it escalated. It went from an assassination in Bosnia to Germany invading Belgium. And when we ask, why did such a crazy escalation happen, the system of alliances was undoubtedly a big part of it. So on the surface, this idea seems very strong, very difficult to argue with. However, it does have some potential weaknesses. I think one important question to ask is, do such systems of alliances always exist? So for instance, if throughout all of human history there have been systems of alliances just like that, then to say that World War I was caused by a system of alliances doesn't seem very strong, because that's always the case. So to put it another way, how unique was that situation that existed before World War I with that system of alliances? In many ways, the more unique that situation was to that particular moment in time, the stronger this whole idea becomes. Well, I would say that it does seem like it was fairly unique to that particular moment in time. For example, if we look at how international relations worked in the 1800s after the Napoleonic Wars were finished, things were really quite different. Now, there were, of course, alliances, but they tended to be much more short-term and dependent on a particular issue at hand. So a good example of that is Prussia, first allying with Austria during the Second Schleswig War of 1864, but then only 2 years later, Prussia went to war with Austria. Another good example of this is Britain and France allying together during the Crimean War of the 1850s, but then, when France went to war with Prussia in 1870, Britain didn't come to France's aid. The alliance during the Crimean War was just for that war. It's not like Britain and France were allies the whole way through the century. In fact, at the time, Britain was actually pursuing a policy called splendid isolation, which was essentially isolationism. That meant that it wanted to avoid alliances and only pursue its own interests. So, as you can see, the 1800s was really characterized by each country fending for itself. There weren't these big alliance blocs, and most importantly, there weren't two equally large and powerful blocs that would be a match for each other if a war broke out. Those two big alliance blocs really started forming at the end of the century. It was in 1879 that Germany and Austria-Hungary signed their alliance. France signed its alliance with Russia in 1894, and Britain only allied with Russia in 1907. So as you can see, those alliance blocs really only crystallized quite a short amount of time before World War I broke out. So, coming back to the tier list, I would say that this idea has a lot going for it. I absolutely think it was necessary for the war to happen the way it did, and crucially, I can imagine the world of 1914 existing without those alliance blocs. And so, in terms of ranking, I think I'm going to give this one an A. Number 6, not realizing how bloody the war would turn out to be. So the idea here is that the leaders of Europe were willing to go to war in 1914, in large part because they were mistaken. They didn't realize how unbelievably horrific the war would turn out to be. And by extension, if they had known, if they'd had any idea that it was going to be this 4-year-long bloodbath, then they wouldn't have done it. They would have found some way to resolve their differences peacefully. So first, let's talk about what this idea has going for it. First, I want to make the case that it's true that Europe's leaders didn't realize just how horrific the war was going to be. Now, there is a fair amount of evidence to support that. For example, here's a quote from the German Emperor, Wilhelm. He actually thought that the war would be over in a matter of weeks. He said to his soldiers, "You will be home before the leaves fall from the trees." Now, Wilhelm was far from the only person thinking along those lines. In fact, the Hungarian Minister for Finance actually thought that the war couldn't go on for more than 3 weeks. More evidence comes from the actions of some of the war ministries. Essentially, we can see, based on what they did, that they weren't planning for a long war. So, for example, the Russian War Ministry rejected requests for new typewriters because they thought that the war was going to be so short that they wouldn't be needed. The Austrian War Ministry actually advised conscripted men not to apply for unemployment compensation because they thought that they would be back in their factories before the applications were even processed. In short, everyone at the time was operating with totally false assumptions about how the war was going to go. I think, in some ways, the most obvious piece of evidence that Europe's leaders didn't know what they were letting themselves in for is the fact that, in many cases, the war went disastrously for them personally. 3 emperors lost power as a direct result of the war. Tsar Nicholas of Russia ended up brutally executed with his family. Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany and Charles of Austria-Hungary were both forced to leave their countries and go into exile. So clearly, in 1914, the emperors of those countries didn't want to get involved in a war that would see their empires destroyed and them lose power. For other nations as well, the war was absolutely catastrophic. Britain and France didn't see their states totally collapse, but they lost an enormous number of men and spent a huge amount of money. France, of course, had much of its north totally destroyed. Serbia lost a whopping 30% of its male population. So long story short, I don't think that in 1914 Europe's leaders would have started the war if they knew that it was going to be that bad. So if it's the case that they didn't know what they were letting themselves in for, that then raises the question of why didn't they realize? Why couldn't they predict the horror that was to come? Well, I think part of the reason is something that I've mentioned previously, the Franco-Prussian War, which was only about 4 decades earlier. That war technically lasted about 9 months, but really the war was pretty much over in less than 2 months. And I think potentially a lot of people in 1914 might have thought that a war would look something like that. Of course, the war turned out to be completely different to that. It turned out to be completely different to any war the world had ever seen. And I think a big part of the reason for that is that there had been big changes in military technology that heavily favored defense. So I'm thinking in particular about machine guns, barbed wire, and heavy artillery. Those new technologies gave defenders a huge advantage and made the war much less mobile. I actually kind of think that World War I happened at quite a unique time. There had been these big improvements in defensive weapons, such as machine guns and barbed wire, but not the invention of powerful new offensive weapons, such as tanks and aeroplanes. I think that's a big part of the reason why World War I was so much less mobile than the wars either side of it, the Franco-Prussian War before it, or the Second World War after it. Even on the Eastern Front in World War I, although it was much more mobile than the Western Front, it was still nowhere near as mobile as the Second World War, for instance. I do actually sometimes wonder whether, if World War I had broken out, say 10 or 20 years later, after tanks and planes had been developed, might the war have been much more mobile and therefore quicker, and maybe therefore much less bloody? Anyway, coming back to the question of why people in 1914 didn't realize just how catastrophic the war was going to be, I think something else worth mentioning is that they wouldn't have taken for granted the fact that, by and large, the combatants didn't collapse. Obviously, the exception there is Russia, but I think Russia is very much the exception which proves the rule. No other major power collapsed. And also, although Russia did collapse, it lasted about 3 years. Now, in my opinion, the fact that the combatants didn't really collapse is actually quite remarkable when we remember that there were some incredibly weak and even frail empires fighting. In particular, I'm thinking of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, both of which at the time people thought were kind of on their last legs, and yet they still managed to hold on for the full 4 years. I think in 1914, most people would have assumed that one or maybe more than one of the nations would collapse quite quickly, which would bring the war to an end much sooner. Now, coming back to the question of whether that miscalculation was a major cause of World War I, the idea does seem strong, but I think we need to add some caveats. The first is that it's actually possible to overstate the extent to which people thought that the war was going to be short. Now, people were definitely engaging in some wishful thinking, but there were some people who recognized that it might well last a very long time. For example, the German general Falkenhayn said, "This war will last at least 1.5 years." Also, when we look at the behavior of many of the leaders during the July crisis, we can see that they were genuinely terrified. I talked earlier about how many of Europe's leaders were devastated when the war was about to break out. The British Prime Minister cried on the eve of war. The French Prime Minister almost had a breakdown when they went to Russia. The German ambassador to Russia also burst into tears when he realized that war was inevitable. All of that seems to imply that deep down, they really did actually know that the war might be absolutely catastrophic. Another problem with this whole idea as a potential cause of World War I is that while it's true that they didn't know exactly what they were getting themselves in for, that's always true. It's just a part of life. Of course, in 1914, they didn't have a crystal ball and couldn't see exactly how things were going to play out, but that's always the case. All wars are, to some degree, based on people not knowing how the war will go. Because, of course, if everyone knew how the war would go, they wouldn't bother fighting in the first place. So for me, that somewhat reduces the value of this idea. So, where to rank this idea? I think I'm going to put it in the B tier. Now, there is definitely some truth to it, but I don't think it's quite as strong as some of the other ideas. Number 7, the idea that everyone at the time thought that attackers had a significant advantage on the battlefield. So this is one of the less talked about potential causes on the list, but it's actually a bit of a favourite of mine. Now, it is going to take some explaining. Essentially, I got this idea from a paper called The Cult of the Offensive and the Origins of the First World War by Stephen Van Everen. Essentially, the idea is that everyone at the time, before the war started, thought that whoever got their troops to the battlefield first would win. They essentially viewed the war as a race to see who could mobilize first and get their forces to the battlefield first. They thought if you could do that before your enemy, then they wouldn't be ready and you would win a quick victory. Now, of course, I'm not saying that turned out to be true. In reality, it was far from the truth. But the idea is that that was the mentality that people had at the time. Now, what is so crucial about that is that it can mean that countries end up going to war even if they don't really want to. It means that even if a country doesn't want a war, it might be so concerned, so anxious, that it's going to get invaded and suffer a quick defeat, that it ends up invading another country just to avoid getting invaded itself. Now, I think when we really think about what it would be like to have that attitude, that set of beliefs, a lot about the escalation before World War I starts to make a lot more sense. The behavior of some of the different countries makes a lot more sense. For instance, it explains why it was such a big deal for Germany when Russia mobilized. I mean, for us now, it might superficially seem like Russia mobilizing wasn't such a big deal. After all, it wasn't intrinsically an act of aggression. Theoretically, Russia might have just wanted to mobilize to prepare for war, but never actually invade Germany. However, if you have this mentality of whoever makes the first move will win, then Russia mobilizing immediately becomes incredibly threatening to Germany. It means that potentially Russia will be able to get its troops to the battlefield first and win that quick victory over Germany. That was the German fear, and that was what led them to issue Russia the ultimatum to stop the mobilization. And of course, Russia's failure to comply with that ultimatum was ultimately how Germany and Russia ended up at war with each other. Now, I also think this idea is a part of how Germany ended up at war with France. Of course, the reason that Germany ended up at war with France was because, again, they issued an ultimatum demanding that France remain neutral. France didn't comply. And so, again, we see that Germany was worried about France going on the offensive, invading Germany and potentially winning a quick victory. Maybe, if the Germans had known that there wasn't going to be a war in which attackers had an advantage, if they'd known that it was going to be a very defensive, a very slow-moving type of war, then they wouldn't have been so determined to get that guarantee from France, and maybe, therefore, they wouldn't have issued the ultimatum and ultimately declared war. So, that is the idea. Let's talk about what this idea has going for it. Well, one thing to say is that I do think the premises are correct. I do think that people at the time thought that attackers had an advantage. Now, there are a whole load of quotes to support that in the paper that I mentioned earlier. For example, Alfred von Schlieffen, author of the famous Schlieffen Plan, said, "Attack is the best defense." Friedrich von Bernhardi, another German general, said, "The offensive mode of action is by far superior to the defensive mode." The German Chief of Staff, Helmuth von Moltke, said, "The offensive is the best defense." And finally, August von Klein stated that Germany ought to be armed for attack. The offensive is the only way of ensuring victory. Now, those are all German generals, but other people from other nations were saying very similar things. For instance, the French Chief of Staff, Joseph Joffre, said, "The French army no longer knows any law other than the offensive. Any other conception ought to be rejected as contrary to the very nature of war." A similar sentiment was expressed by the French president, Armand Fayet. He said, "The offensive alone is suited to the temperament of French soldiers. We are determined to march straight against the enemy without hesitation." One last quote is from Émile Drian, who was a member of the French Chamber of Deputies. He said, "The first great battle will decide the whole war, and wars will be short. The idea of the offensive must penetrate the spirit of our nation." So that's probably more than enough quotes. Hopefully you get the idea. Everyone at the time thought that the way to win was to go on the offensive. The next question then is, why did everyone think that? And I think a lot of the answer, again, relates to the Franco-Prussian War that I've mentioned several times in the video. The key thing to focus on is that a key part of why Prussia won that very fast victory is that it got its troops to the front first. There were a few key battles right at the beginning of the war where the Prussians outnumbered the French, and that essentially won them the war. Now, don't forget, that war was only 44 years before World War I, so it's very easy to see why people would have been extremely concerned about other nations mobilizing and achieving a quick victory. Now, I do think it's worth quickly mentioning that for people to be thinking along those lines wasn't crazy or stupid. There are definitely wars that are like that, where they're all about the offensive, where they're all about speed. Obviously, the Franco-Prussian War that I just mentioned, but also the Second World War. A big part of the reason why Germany was able to defeat France was down to speed. It was because they moved so unbelievably fast that the French and the Allies were just blindsided. They couldn't react fast enough. They couldn't organize a counterattack fast enough. And of course, that meant that they got encircled and it was a disaster. So my point is, there are wars that are determined by the offensive. And so the quotes that I read out earlier, they aren't necessarily stupid. They do apply to some wars. It's just the case that World War I was absolutely not one of those types of wars. It was a slow-moving war. And for the most part, if you were attacking, that normally meant taking more casualties than the defenders. And coming back to whether this caused World War I think potentially if everyone at the time had known that, then the July crisis would definitely not have gone the way it did. So, where to rank this idea? Well, I really think there's a lot to this idea, and I have to say it's one of my favorites. I think it explains why Russia mobilized. I think it explains why Germany was so adamant that Russia stop mobilizing. I think it explains why Germany was so determined to get a guarantee of neutrality from France. I mean, just those three things alone are huge steps in the escalation of the July crisis. So I think this is a very strong idea, and I'm going to give it an A. Okay, number 8, Emperor Wilhelm changing German foreign policy. So this is one of the more long-term ideas on the list, and it's going to take a little bit of explaining. The idea is essentially that throughout the 1800s, all of the countries of Europe had a fairly stable foreign policy, and for almost all of them, that foreign policy remained the same right up until 1914, with one big exception, Germany. Supposedly, Germany radically changed its foreign policy while all the other nations of Europe kept theirs the same. The idea is that with the dismissal of Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor, and the coming to power of Wilhelm II, Germany started behaving very differently towards the rest of Europe. It started to be much more aggressive and more assertive towards other nations. And the idea is that that played a big part in causing World War I. So to put the idea another way, if Germany had continued behaving the way it did under Bismarck, then World War I wouldn't have happened. So, to try to address this idea, I first want to explain why people argue that there was this big change in German foreign policy. So first, I think it would be good to talk about what things were like in the 1800s under Bismarck. Well, the first thing to say is that Bismarck's top priority was preserving peace and stability in Europe. Crucially, he wasn't interested in Germany having faraway colonies all over the globe or a big navy. That's really demonstrated well in a quote from 1873. The British ambassador wrote to the British Foreign Secretary to tell him about a meeting that he'd had with Bismarck. In his words, Bismarck desired neither colonies nor fleets for Germany. Colonies, in his opinion, would only be a cause of weakness because they could only be defended by powerful fleets, and Germany's geographical position did not necessitate its development into a first-class maritime power. When colonies were offered to him, he rejected them and wished only for coaling stations acquired by treaty from other nations. Now, it should be said that Germany did eventually acquire some colonies in Africa, but crucially, it had far fewer than Britain or France. Overall, Bismarck was very much not focused on building a big global empire like the British had. In fact, his main preoccupation was actually France. He really saw France as Germany's main rival, and his goal in all his foreign policy was to keep France as isolated as possible. His main fear was Germany having to fight a two-front war in which it would fight France and Russia at the same time. And as we know, he was right to fear that. Overall, Bismarck's main priority was to maintain peace and to keep Germany out of conflicts as much as possible. In fact, there's a really great quote to support that. Bismarck famously said about the Balkans that they were, in his words, not worth the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier. So, as you can see, he was focused on a very defined set of national priorities, and he didn't want a single German soldier to die for anything else. Overall, Bismarck was very successful in his foreign policy. While he was in charge, France did remain diplomatically isolated, and no major wars broke out. All of that came to a spectacular end in 1888, when Wilhelm II came to the throne. Now, Wilhelm was a very different man to Bismarck. In fact, the two men actually had a very bad relationship, and in 1890, so that's only 2 years after Wilhelm came to power, Wilhelm forced Bismarck to resign. Now, the resignation letter that Bismarck wrote is actually pretty astonishing in the tone that it takes. In it, Bismarck made clear that he was against what he saw as Wilhelm's foreign policy, and he basically said that Wilhelm was ruining everything that he had achieved in his foreign policy. In his letter, he wrote, "It would be impossible for me to implement the orders stipulated by Your Majesty with regard to foreign policy. It would be impossible after Your Majesty's recent decisions on the direction of our foreign policy. If I were to do so, it would call into question all of the important successes attained for the German Reich under a foreign policy in keeping with the wishes of Your Majesty's 2 late successors." So essentially, he's saying that Wilhelm wanted to completely change German foreign policy, and he's saying that what he wanted to do would jeopardize the successes that Germany had had under the previous monarchs. Bismarck then said that if he did what Wilhelm wanted, it would affect all of the successes attained over decades and under unfavorable conditions in our relations with Russia. So I'm sure you'd agree that for Bismarck to criticize the emperor, that frankly is pretty noteworthy. Anyway, with Bismarck gone, Wilhelm completely transformed Germany's foreign policy. He basically abandoned the careful balance of power diplomacy that Bismarck had pursued and embraced what was called Weltpolitik, which basically means world policy. So here's a quote to support that. Wilhelm said, "Germany has great tasks to accomplish outside the narrow boundaries of old Europe." And he continued, "Our future lies less in Europe than the entire world." So, as you can see, Wilhelm had a very, very different attitude to that which Bismarck had. Now, one of the biggest differences between Wilhelm and Bismarck is that Wilhelm was much more interested in accruing colonies for Germany. Perhaps the best example of that is the Moroccan crises that I mentioned earlier, where Germany got involved in what most countries saw as France's sphere of influence. Another good example is an incident that happened in China in 1897, what is called the Juyi incident. Basically what happened is 2 German Catholic missionaries were killed by Chinese locals, and Wilhelm used that as a justification to demand territory from the Chinese government as compensation. He actually threatened a naval attack if his demands weren't met. The Chinese government was incredibly weak at the time, and so they were forced to comply, and they gave Wilhelm the territory of Qingdao. Now, there are several other examples of Wilhelm wanting colonies. For example, in 1899, he bought some Pacific islands from Spain. Another very dark example of all this is what happened in Namibia. Germany first got a foothold in Namibia when it became a protectorate in 1884, and then the Germans decided to settle the region with German colonists. As you'd imagine, that didn't go down well with the locals, and so there was a lot of tension between the native population and the German colonists. That ultimately turned into an uprising in 1904, which Wilhelm brutally crushed, leading to the killing of up to 90,000 Namibians. Many of you might be aware that that is often called the first genocide of the 20th century. Anyway, as you can see, Wilhelm definitely wanted colonies a lot more than Bismarck had. And that's important partly because it led to the Moroccan crises, but also because it was one of the key reasons that he wanted to build up the German Navy, which of course led to the naval arms race that I talked about earlier. However, I think something even more important that Wilhelm did was his decision not to renew a treaty with Russia. What happened was, in 1887, when Bismarck was still in power, Germany signed what was called the Reinsurance Treaty with Russia. The Reinsurance Treaty was basically intended to calm relations between Russia and Germany. Both countries agreed that they would remain neutral if the other country got involved in a war with another great power. Now, what is really important about the Reinsurance Treaty is that it only lasted for 3 years, after which time it was supposed to be renewed. However, by that point, Wilhelm was in power, and he decided not to renew the treaty. Now, in my opinion, the importance of that decision cannot be overstated. For a start, it obviously damaged relations between Germany and Russia, which made them much more likely to go to war with each other. But another really important consequence is that it led to Russia getting closer to France, which ultimately resulted in them signing the Franco-Russian alliance only 4 years later. Of course, the Franco-Russian alliance was absolutely crucial for the escalation of the July crisis to happen the way it did. Now, I think it's worth quickly going into why Wilhelm decided not to renew the Reinsurance Treaty. One of the big reasons is that essentially he felt that Russia was getting more out of it than Germany was. For example, Russia needed Germany's support in a dispute that it had with the Ottomans, but it didn't really have anything to offer Germany in return. Another major reason that Wilhelm didn't want to renew the treaty is that he wanted Germany to move closer to Austria. And as you might be aware, Austria and Russia had quite bad relations at the time. Up until that point, Germany had been trying to have good relations with both Russia and Austria at the same time, but Wilhelm essentially came to the conclusion that that was not going to be possible. So essentially, rather than trying to maintain this kind of middle position between two rivals, he decided to take a clear stance and favour Austria. One last reason that Wilhelm didn't renew the treaty is that he thought that distancing Germany from Russia would help Germany's relations with Britain. Britain at the time had bad relations with Russia because they were involved in a power struggle in Afghanistan, what was called the Great Game. And so Wilhelm hoped that by distancing Germany from Russia, he would be able to cozy up to Britain, and that in turn would help him in his disputes with France. Anyway, coming back to the tier list, the question is, did Wilhelm transform German foreign policy? And if so, did that cause World War I? Well, I do think this idea is fairly strong. I do think that Wilhelm changed Germany's foreign policy, and crucial, I do think it's very likely that if Germany had stayed as it was, if it had maintained that Bismarckian type of foreign policy that it had previously, then World War I would have been far less likely to happen. In particular, I think Wilhelm's decision not to renew the treaty with Russia strikes me as potentially a huge moment, and it's very easy to see how that contributed to the outbreak of World War I. In terms of weaknesses of this idea, for me the only thing is the fact that it is quite long-term and indirect. For instance, the decision not to renew the treaty with Russia was in 1890, which was a full 24 years before the outbreak of World War I. So its relationship with the outbreak of World War I is a little bit indirect, and for that reason I am going to mark it down a bit. But overall, I think it's a good theory, I think it's a good idea, and so I'm going to give it a B. Okay, now for our last potential cause. This is the decline of the Ottoman Empire. This one is fairly straightforward. The idea is essentially that in the centuries before World War I broke out, the Ottoman Empire had been declining. About 400 years earlier, the Ottoman Empire reached its height in the mid-1500s when it controlled all of the Balkans up to and including Hungary. Now, over time, the Ottoman Empire gradually declined and lost control of those regions. And ultimately, by the start of the 1900s, the Ottomans had very little power in the Balkans. Now, the reason that mattered is because it meant that as the Ottoman Empire declined, it left the Balkans as a very unstable region. Essentially, the Balkans had some very poorly defined and disputed boundaries. Overall, it was by far the most unstable and combustible region in Europe. I think it's worth saying that people at the time were well aware of that. For instance, there's a very famous quote from Bismarck from 1888. He supposedly said, "One day, the great European war will come out of some damned foolish thing in the Balkans." So, if the Balkans were so unstable, that leads us to the question of why, and a big part of the reason is, of course, the decline of the Ottoman Empire. How the decline of the Ottoman Empire could have led to the instability of the Balkans is fairly easy to understand. Essentially, as the Ottomans lost control of those areas, what was going to happen to them was contested. One option was that they become their own nations, which is, of course, what happened to the likes of Greece or Serbia. As you would imagine, that is, for the most part, what the local populations wanted. Another option is that they could be gobbled up by the other two big empires in the region, Austria or Russia. In fact, it was precisely because Austria and Russia were both trying to get as much Balkan territory as possible that they developed their rivalry, and that is one of the key reasons that their relationship soured. Anyway, by the end of the 1800s, the map of the Balkans was extremely complicated and, frankly, a bit mad. Some regions had full independence from the Ottomans. Other areas were, on paper, part of the Ottoman Empire, and they were internationally recognized as part of the Ottoman Empire, but in reality, the Ottomans had no control over those regions. The most important example of that is, of course, Bosnia, which was still officially part of the Ottoman Empire, but was administered by Austria-Hungary. That is, of course, what led to the Bosnian crisis of 1908. In summary, the whole situation was a mess, and it was that mess that made the region so prone to instability and violence. So, coming back to the outbreak of World War I, the idea is, if the Ottoman Empire had remained strong, if it remained in control of the Balkans, that region wouldn't have become so incredibly unstable, and therefore World War I wouldn't have happened. So first I want to talk about some of the issues that I've got with this idea. The first is that, for me, it's very, very difficult to imagine a world in which the Ottoman Empire didn't decline. In fact, I've actually done a video about why the Ottoman Empire became so weak, and if you've watched that, you'll know that their problems were very, very deep-rooted. They were structural. That means that it's very difficult for me to imagine an Ottoman Empire that made it to the 1900s still very strong and still with a firm grip over the Balkans. Now, another problem I have with this idea is that it's just a bit undefined and vague. I mean, even if we were to postulate a world in which the Ottoman Empire was still very strong in the early 1900s, the question is, how exactly would that have happened? There is an infinite number of ways that that might have happened. It's kind of the opposite of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, where in that case, it's very easy to imagine a specific counterfactual where Franz Ferdinand takes a different turning in his car and therefore isn't assassinated. And therefore, we have a very good idea of what Europe would have looked like the next day if Franz Ferdinand hadn't been assassinated. It would have looked essentially exactly the same as it looked the day before. However, a world in which the Ottoman Empire was still strong in the early 1900s is just such a completely different planet to the one that we're actually living in that it becomes a bit hard to evaluate. So, for those reasons, I think this idea is not the strongest, and so I think I'm going to put it in the C tier. So here we have the final ranking. In the A tier, we have the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Britain not being clear about what it would do, the system of alliances, and everyone thinking that attackers had a significant advantage. In the B tier, we have people not realizing how long and bloody the war would be, and the imperialism of Wilhelm II. In the C tier, we have the naval arms race between Britain and Germany and the decline of the Ottoman Empire. And in the D tier, we have French resentment because of Alsace and Lorraine. Interestingly, I haven't put anything in the S tier, and I think that's appropriate, really. I do think one of the things that makes this such a difficult and famous question is that there are so many different things that contributed to the outbreak of the war. There's not one factor that really explains everything. So there we have it. There are the causes of World War I put in their correct place. The question has been put to bed. Congratulations, one and all. I expect to see no further books, articles, or videos about the question. Thank you.